Okay, so welcome back, everybody, to the Marketing Rules podcast. And I am joined today by Nate Guggia, who is employer brand kind of guru, expert, extraordinaire. I'm already embarrassing him. Look. I hate the word guru as well, but I use to usually to embarrass people. Nate, it is a pleasure to have you on the Marketing Rules podcast. If no one has kind of seen you online, can you just kind of give us a little bit of an intro to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I'm Nate. I'm definitely not the smartest person in this industry. I think I just market myself the best. So
sometimes that's all it needs.
Yeah, probably. I lead brand marketing at a company called Job Portraits. We're a creative studio based in the Bay Area in the United States. We are specifically a content studio for the most part, and we produce employer branding content almost exclusively for growth stage tech companies, mostly VC backed. That's our specialty. We've been doing it for 6 or 7 years. And that's kind of like the world I live in. So when it comes to employer branding, that's really the lens I see it through.
I tell you, what's interesting is how long have you been doing this, Nate? Because I became aware of you maybe a couple of months ago, but you've definitely done something different recently. You've come to. I think you're in a lot of people's kind of top of mind when it comes to employer branding at the minute. So I think you've definitely changed something up, and the fact that obviously we're based in the UK, and do you have any UK kind of companies that you work with?
No, so a lot of our clients will have international locations, offices, and so we will work globally, but as far as direct clients go, we don't. Although just like over time, like I've started doing more and more podcasts and interviews and things with UK based folks. So started developing a lot of relationships.
So it's definitely working because you've got quite a presence now. It's.
Oh, thanks. I'm happy to talk about that too. How it's kind of evolved.
But you know what? Let's talk about kind of employer branding. And what I wanted to talk about was trying to be a kind of little kind of future thinking and talk about employer branding 2021 and kind of beyond. Really, let's park 2020. I think we'd all like to try and do that, and kind of look kind of to the future. And I suppose if we could start with kind of this movement around the digital workplace, where more people, everybody is now working from online. We've had this kind of push and maybe kind of accelerated push to lots of businesses to move to a digital kind of workplace, basically, whether that's working from home and having to put all kinds of things in place to allow people to work from home. How do you see that affecting the employer brand, and what's your kind of opinion around that?
I think initially it created some challenges. I think now it's opened up a wide world of opportunity. I've seen in projects that we're working on and just also like in my own company, let's just say working remote, we'll start there. It actually allows for more access to employees. Whereas before, like in a workplace, especially like at, large companies, busy startups, things like that, like it's busy. It can be somewhat chaotic. It can be very siloed. But now that we're all working kind of in our own little environments, I've seen that project management, when it comes to employer branding, which used to be kind of difficult to pull off, has now become a lot easier because people are a little bit more structured and they're kind of they're in one place. It's also opened up an opportunity for different types of content that weren't, let's say, available or accepted before. One of them being video. So I think like not having the live experience at first was kind of like employer brand leaders were kind of like, what are we going to do? We don't have everybody here. But I think now if you can just see this for the opportunity that it really is, it could actually be more efficient. It could be more creative and extremely relevant, which the relevancy part has been an issue with employer branding, I think, for a long time. So we can start there. Yeah.
So those are kind of some of the positives. What about the negatives you see around this?
Yeah, the negatives are, I mean, if the company, it could be damaging to company culture and perception of the employer brand, right? Which, like, when it comes down to it, employer branding is just, it's the perception that your employees and or candidates have about what it's like to work at your company. If this has been a botched experience, that's going to reflect negatively. So I think, like, there are companies who have transitioned and implemented things in a very positive way.
Yeah.
That goes the other way too, you know? And so I guess that would be the downside. But again, though, I'm a big advocate for truth telling. And that might sound like an obvious thing, but you know, when it comes to branding and positioning and stuff, that isn't always the approach. But I think, like, even companies who own some of the challenges that they've been through and what they've done to, like, overcome it, it's very relatable and respected by candidates. And so I'm a kind of a silver lining person. If you can see the opportunity, you can always, like, turn something around like that.
I just want to kind of swing back to the kind of relevancy piece that you kind of mentioned before. And kind of tell us a little bit more about that and how that is going to, how kind of this digital workplace and technology has affected that kind of relevancy, and how you see that being maybe affected, you know, within the next kind of couple of years with, you know, with the position of people working partly from home, partly in an office, and how you then keep that relevancy kind of moving forward.
Okay. Yeah. So there's this movement. There has been for a long time, but I think in employer branding, it's become very apparent that candidates want to hear from people, not from companies. We've known that on the marketing side for quite a while, but in employer branding is, like, just moves a lot slower. They're a little bit, behind the ball. And so it's been a lot of company talk, and now's the opportunity for employees to have a voice. And so we know that candidates want that. They want to hear from people. And, like, I think about the stuff that you and I are doing right now. There's absolutely an opportunity for somebody who leads employer branding to do something like this with employees. To interview employees, we're all so comfortable with this level of quality, both, like, video and audio, that could be scaled up. Like, you could start creating content at a scale that you weren't able to before, just because we're able to do stuff like this, and it's all relevant to us. Like, that's what I mean by relevant. It's just, like, it absolutely fits what the market wants now. And it's not that hard to pull off.
That's interesting, because that kind of ties into, something I think we discussed earlier was, Gartner always releases the kind of, like, hype cycles for the year, and they released the digital workplace hype cycle. And one of the things that's at the peak of their cycle element is this voice of the employee. And, obviously in the hype cycle, it's obviously more referring to the kind of technology around that, but that kind of more inward facing, pushing outwards with regards to the kind of voice of the employee stories. I think that's kind of, like you said, I think that's going to become more and more relevant.
It is. And so the kind of like the one code that everyone's trying to crack in employer branding is, how do we get our employees to participate? How do we get them excited enough to want to be co-creators? I think it's too much to expect employees to be creators on their own. because some of us are inclined to do that naturally. And for those people, it's very important to let them run with it. But that's a small group of people who just like are naturally inclined to want to have a voice. But there's a whole other subset who would, or who might have that inclination, but just aren't aware of it. And they need some help. They need some enablement. And so this is where I really think of like structure, frameworks, how to guidance, things internally to help your employees, to help bring out that voice. And so like back to what you were talking about, if you can, let's say, interview employees across functions, like think about engineers, right? Engineers, probably the hardest group to get to like speak out publicly. But what if you could get on and you could do an interview series with members of the engineering team and you ask them all the questions that you know your candidates want answered. All of your engineering candidates care about 9 or 10 things. Yeah. Talk to your engineering team about that. You do the heavy lifting of asking the questions to draw the information out. That is so much content that, again, back to relevancy, it's just, I don't know. I just see that as the function. Like we got to start thinking about ways that enable employees to have this voice instead of just like talking about it or thinking that they're going to do it naturally, because they're not.
I suppose kind of the next level up from that might be, if we take your engineers example, is getting other engineers to interview the engineers, you know, yes. and to kind of like, so you select the people, or you identify the people who are these creators anyway, the ones who are more inclined to kind of go down that route, because it would be very hard for me, you, anyone who's possibly not working as an engineer to get down to the kind of things that other engineer candidates want to talk about.
Yeah.
Me and you can talk about employer branding and marketing all day, but neither of us are engineers. So interviewing an engineer would be, useless, because we just don't speak the same language. We just don't know the terms. We don't have all the acronyms. We don't have that kind of experience. But yeah, if you can get to a stage where you've kind of got another engineer who's kind of that way inclined, and however you would kind of, so they're the ones who are then kind of talking the same language and eking out whatever needs to be eked out that is relevant to when they were trying to kind of applying for this job, the kind of questions that they wanted to kind of ask.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. And, and then there's, so there's like the creative side of it, and then there's the distribution side of it. But if you get employees involved, they're more inclined to want to help distribute. Mm-hmm. They're part of this thing. They want to share it with friends, family, on social, whatever it might be. They want to help get that word out. But I think like also too, if you think about this, like what kind of assets can I create to help my recruiters recruit better? And if you start there and you go like, okay, I'm going to create this content for them, instead of thinking like, oh, I'm going to create this content, and then you can get caught up in the expectations of external engagement and all this kind of stuff. It's like, if you create a podcast and you break it up into seasons, and season 1 is your engineering team, think about all those assets that your recruiters can send to interested engineers as they start going through the hiring process.
Yeah.
And then it just opens up a wide like scope of different things you can do with it.
Well, that kind of opens up kind of a larger question in how embedded your in-house recruitment team are, isn't it? Because at that point, if they're working in a silo, and I suppose this kind of comes back to some of the things that we picked up on at the start is, if you're working from home a lot, you can be quite siloed, and suddenly you're disconnected from, let's take the engineer, you're disconnected from the engineering team. So there's a real kind of effort, I think, to be able to kind of re-embed yourself into them, to continually keep up with them, to continually kind of make those connections. But which is probably easier if when you're in an office, to kind of understand how the rest of the business works, and understand what the engineering team really want from their candidates. And that's maybe kind of the things, again, coming back to kind of the future and where kind of where this kind of digital and home-based working mixed with kind of office-based working, I can see some issues around that, kind of how you kind of keep these teams together when the one part of the team's only in the office for half the week, then they're at home, and then it all gets quite disparate. Kind of managing that, I think for me, it seems to be one of the real challenges with regards to kind of employer branding over the next kind of few years.
Yeah, it is.
You don't have to give me an answer. I'm not scared, but
no.
But you know what I mean. I think that's where. But I mean, I think that's not just a challenge for employer branding. That's a challenge for businesses in general. But if you are a business that is, continue looking to hire, like your tech startups, then that's a real thing to try and overcome, isn't it?
It is. Early on, I saw the power that just content in general, the power that it has when it's shared internally. It can be a unifying. It can unify a culture. It can bring people together. It can give exposure to things that employees, like, let's say outside of that function, they've never had a look inside of like how this team operates or how these people think. And I think like if you can approach it that way too, and have this intention of like, when I create something, this is for my people. Mm-hmm. Because every time that happens and we watch a video or read a blog post about a person at our company or about our company or whatever, it just like, it brings us closer to that person or those people or to our company, little by little by little. And it's a constant reminder of like why we're doing this, which is easy. That can get lost, like you're sitting at home and you can forget the specialness or the uniqueness. And I think content actually can play that role if it's distributed appropriately.
I completely agree. I think some of the times the problem with there is that if you're a big enough company, you've probably got an internal comms team, and they're the ones who have kind of taken over doing that role. And again, if you're in a business that's siloed, you can imagine the internal comms team never really talking to the recruiters, and using that as and the internal recruiters probably not talking to the internal comms team, as a flow. Because again, one thing with employer branding, and I hope this kind of this is things I hope to change. It can be very outward facing instead of being quite internally focused, and understanding that you get lost in how do we look to the outside world, which really, I think for me, isn't really employer branding. It's about we know that employer branding is about empowering your current employees, but when you start looking outside and trying to kind of give this false impression instead of looking back inwards, but to do that, you've got to do it with the other teams that are involved.
So I'm glad you brought that up. So it's like if you create things for your people, for your employees, you can use it externally, but it's always going to ring true. It's like, to use the authentic word, I'm going to use it, but it's always going to stay authentic, because there's no better judge of that content than your employees. Mm-hmm. You're basically like, you're creating things that reflect their experience, and creating, it will always keep you honest. It will make you'll stay creative, and it will create this like natural, like organic distribution by like going to them and allowing them to put it back out, instead of it just being, like you were saying, like this external thing. And that's why I think I saw this happen too many times. Companies stopped hiring and they started cutting employer brand leaders, and then they started cutting recruiting teams, and they didn't realize they had so much focus on employer branding being this external thing that suddenly, if we stopped hiring and our company is suffering, we don't need that anymore. Mm-hmm. Because we're not trying to attract people. Instead of going like, this is the opportunity for us to keep people
Yeah.
and make people feel like heard and safe. And because it's going to turn around. And then what happens is they start hiring again, and they've had these scaled back teams who are like under resourced, overwhelmed, and like the whole thing is broken now.
Yeah. Your focus has been in completely the wrong place, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I really think like if you were just to solely take the approach, like we are doing employer branding for our people, it will, the whole thing will just fall into place.
Yeah. No, I love that idea. You're right. It's one of those things that kind of gets missed, I think, or is just misunderstood about what employer branding should be. That it's too outward facing, and that it is, I love the idea of you just, take care of your people and brand to your people now.
Yeah.
And then those are just true, authentic stories that when they're shared with the outside world are still going to continue to be authentic and true and relevant, coming back to the relevancy word again. You've mentioned kind of content quite a few times now. I know that's an area where you guys kind of specialize in, so let's talk around kind of content and the kind of employer branding content, in next year and beyond, and what that could look like, whether that is, what's the kind of things that we want to be talking about, what are the kind of what are the potential, I don't want to really go into kind of delivery methods, but maybe kind of formats that you kind of see, and how the kind of things you want to really be kind of talking about. And obviously I guess it's going to be slightly influenced in a kind of post-COVID world, but what do you see that kind of, how do you see that what's that conversation look like over the next kind of few years?
Okay. I mentioned it earlier, but I think this type of video, for one, and when I say this type of video, I mean Zoom or whatever platform you're using, is this middle ground. But so pre-COVID, when it came to video, there was really two choices. There was really polished, high production, resource intensive, just expensive video. They look really great. They don't necessarily have the longest shelf life. And you kind of end up with like, what the hell do we do with this besides put it on our career site? Right?
Yeah.
Then on the other side, there was employee generated content, which in my opinion is next to impossible to pull off at scale. It takes a level of buy-in and participation, and it just doesn't, I've never really seen it work. But now we found this middle ground, because we all talk over Zoom all day long. And now this level of quality is what we're used to. We accept it. It's like, it's not recorded from my iPhone, but it's not high production with a crew. And so now suddenly this idea of authentic content video content at scale is possible. It's possible because we already have the technology. Editing this stuff down for social is really easy. Most companies have the internal resources to do it. I mean, you know what it takes. It's like simple software and throwing subtitles on. So the opportunity for video content now is like, it's greater than it ever has been, and cheaper. So you can move really quickly with this. Now, that being said, I think the move is away from organizational culture, but into micro team culture. Again, going back to this idea of like, candidates want to hear from people. They want to look inside of what is relatable. What is most relatable to them is the teams and the people that they would be working, like, quote unquote, next to. We don't want to hear from companies, and we actually don't touch the larger organizational culture very much at all, but we touch our team culture day in and day out. That's what matters. So we want to hear from the people on the teams we'd be working with, from those function leaders. We want to know what they're working on, problems they're solving, how they think. So I think like we got to get away from like company culture, and we got to think about this as like micro cultures that make up this big org structure.
Yeah.
And how do we tell those stories?
Yeah.
So those are two things, and that can be done in written or video format.
And do you see kind of moving forward, is it all now kind of video and that kind of video and audio format? Is the days of the kind of a day in the life kind of written type thing, is that dead? Is that gone, basically?
I think when it comes to written content, you should really think about written content is really valuable when it's evergreen. And there's some core pieces that I think every company should have. These are recruiter assets that, if anything, will need just updates as your processes or experiences improve, but that's it. Every company should have a written candidate FAQ. They should have a written blog post that gives you a look inside the hiring process, so it manages all expectations. Every company should have an opinion piece about their industry, like a stake in the ground. Yep. Like, this is why we do what we do, and this is our belief about the industry. Like it or not, this is it. Mm-hmm. That's like attract and repel content. And another one too is the basics like of our business. It's like, how many times do you go to a company website and you go, what the hell do they do? Yeah. And as candidates, it's even more confusing.
Yeah.
And so there just needs to be a blog post that is like bare bones, like simple language. This is what we do. These are the problems we're solving. I think if you can have those four assets, those are recruiter assets. They can live on your careers page. When candidates are doing research, it will just show them that you care, you understand them.
Yeah. And everything beyond that, kind of video or audio, pretty much.
I think so, because like, you know, there's sorry about my dog.
It's okay.
There's so much that you can do with this. I mean, what we're doing right now, this could be who knows how many individual video clips that are 30 to 90 seconds long. Yep. You can do the same and rip the audio. It could be a podcast. I mean, it's like,
yeah. So kind of on the back of that, one thing we haven't really kind of discussed is how the employer branding and those kinds of touch points work at different levels of an organization. So we talked about the engineers and their team. You know, how would you make employer branding relatable across the entire business? So, you know, for, you know, even for a very C-suite level, all the way down to kind of management level. And then, you know, that's different approaches to different people wanting different things out of the business at different times, you know, and, you know, I mean, it almost sounds pretty much almost impossible to kind of hit every point for everybody within your business.
Yeah. Employer branding has long suffered from nobody outside of their bubble knowing what they do. From employees all the way up to the top. It's like, what is this stuff? Which means it's been very difficult to get not just buy-in, but budget to do, and resources to just get anything done. I think that's been the biggest blocker for employer branding. It's a lack of awareness. So, you know, there's a lot of talk, or there has been a lot of talk about employer branding getting a seat at the table and blah, blah, blah. You know, like, I'm not saying that's not correct, because that does need to happen. But I think at a practical level, what really needs to happen is employer brand leaders need the opportunity to show their worth. And the way that you can show your worth is by showing your work and connecting that to impact it can have on business results. Mm-hmm. But I've experienced this even just recently, where an employer brand leader who's never been able to create anything because they've been blocked had the opportunity to create something. And that something got people really excited because she was able to show in her industry or in her company, this is what it looks like. When somebody can see this is what it looks like, they go, oh, that's what you've been talking about? This sounds really cool. And people really like this. Maybe we should do some more of it. I'm telling you, that sounds so simplistic, but it's actually what needs to happen. It's like, you need to do something that you can then show. It's like show and tell, show it to other people, and the light bulbs go on and they go, oh, this is cool. Now I get it.
Yeah. I mean, it seems kind of counterintuitive to have someone on board who's looking after employer branding, who then you stifle and block from actually doing their job. I mean, it seems crazy, but I just want to kind of just dig a little deeper with regards to kind of, so that's how you kind of get employer brand known. But is it possible to have an employer brand that covers an entire company? And this is kind of like, so an employer brand that is attractive to every level within a business, and I can see why. It just seems kind of, obviously the first step is to make sure it's taken seriously within your business. But then how do you then just kind of deploy that from, if we take the engineer example, an employer brand and what attracts an engineer to your business is going to be different to what attracts someone at C-suite level or management level. I mean, there's a subtleties that kind of there. So I think that brings its own complications.
Yeah, and that's the issue I have with EVPs, to be honest. The bigger the company, the bigger those initiatives are and the more expensive they are and the longer they take. But, a strategist can come in, or a firm can come in and do a big EVP that represents the entire company. Well, the truth of the matter is like, and I know this from the projects we've done too, is that EVP, let's say, can take off quickly and the people involved are excited about it. But when it starts getting up to final approval to sign off on it, that becomes a big, big blocker, to the point sometimes where projects just get straight up cut or stalled because the people at the top aren't accepting or disagree with all of the information being provided to them, which is hilarious because that information that's being provided to them is how their employees actually see this company.
Yeah.
It's like straight up from the employees. And they're just like, no, that's not it. Okay. So that's why I have issues with EVPs, because I think you can put months and months of work in, tons of money and internal resources to get this all together to kind of get you back to the same place you were before, and maybe even to a more frustrating place. Right.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm big on like execution over strategy, and that you let the execution create the strategy, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so again, like back to your point, which I think is it's very astute, is that to make this stuff relevant, creating, I'll just keep calling it content. Content means audio, visual, whatever. Okay. Creating things for these individual microcultures, these individual groups, starts opening this up. And actually it starts surfacing, if you ask the right questions, it actually starts surfacing the values and a lot of the information that you would get from like a big EVP initiative anyway. It just does it in a lot more like natural way while you're actually creating things. Mm-hmm. So you keep creating, you get learnings, you improve, you create, you get learning. It creates this feedback, and you can do that for these subgroups across the organization. Gets people excited, gives you more stuff to share internally, stuff starts filtering up. It's just, I think that is honestly the most practical approach that is going to get the best and the fastest results.
I mean, we haven't really kind of touched on EVP because I agree it's a bit of a minefield and not an area of my kind of expertise. But I mean, if your EVP is as simple as, we're going to push it down to a micro team level, and that's how that's how it's going to be. Kind of that's the proposition is on that level, as opposed to on a kind of a global kind of position. Yeah. I mean,
because I mean, there's an idea of it's like TVP, team value proposition. But that's what really matters. And it's like, you just have to think about what matters to your two markets. Your two markets are your employees and your candidates. Mm-hmm. Reverse engineer off of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, and geez, if you're seeing employer branding purely as like a talent acquisition enabler or whatever, then then even more so, like, it just only makes sense to like narrow this and make it just like personal and relatable. And I just don't think like a broader EVP, I don't think it does it.
Yeah.
But like employer brand traditionalists or anybody like would hear what I'm saying right now and like completely disagree. But
is that because because there's a lot of money in EVP?
There's a lot of there's a lot of money in EVPs. And full disclosure, we do them.
Yeah.
But this and it's like still like I'm comfortable saying that, like, I think for most companies it's a waste of time and money, and they could get a lot more done and learn a lot more just by focusing on execution the right way.
Well, maybe that's the kind of the greatest takeaway from this is that the future of employer branding is to dump the EVP and move to was it TVP, was the team value proposition? I mean, I'd never heard of that. That sounds, I mean, and that just kind of ties in completely to what we're saying and feels natural kind of moving forward. As I said, the discussion today was around, kind of employer branding kind of moving forward. And that focusing on teams seems much
it just sensible. Seems, it does. It's like, I look at EVPs, like, just because something's been done one way for a long time doesn't mean that it's the right way anymore. And I just don't think
tradition can be a real stifler, basically.
Yeah. I think we've moved to a new era. Different things matter.
Yeah, I completely agree. And on that note, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Nate.
Thanks, man.
We will include all of your details in the show notes if anybody wants to get in contact with you. I kind of, people should be kind of watching your content as well, because it's, you do a lot of these podcasts, and to be honest, it's not just kind of regurgitating the same stuff, which you see a lot of people do. I'm guilty of that. But it is all very good stuff. It's all unique, and it is all worth kind of listening to, and you really do kind of know your stuff, and it's really engaging as well.
Thanks,
and
man.
And just to watch the kind of how the whitewash wall changes, basically.
Depending on the temperature here in California.
So anyway, it's been a pleasure, Nate, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you too. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Bye.